Welcome to Cultivated Live for Tuesday, March 5th. I'm Jay Rosenthal. I'm the co-founder of Cultivated Media and the host of Cultivated Live. You can find us on cultivated.news. You can see it right here. I'm here today with Brad Spirrison of Grown In. Brad, nice to see you.
Always a pleasure. Another week in the books.
Another week in the books. And this is actually, you are my co-host on Tuesdays for Cultivated Live for something called the United States of Cannabis. And in many parts of the country, it's actually an election day. So it's fortuitous that we're doing this on an election day, which is, I think, why we do this on a Tuesday. I'm not 100% sure. Does that sound right?
Works for me. But I could see you every day of the week if it were up to me.
It's very nice. We have a great program today. And so we're going to jump into it because shortly, very shortly, they're behind stage. We have the Brain Trust in New Hampshire pushing for legalization. And we can't wait to see State Representative Anita Burroughs. We have former State Representative Timothy Egan, who's in a car, which is going to be awesome. And Daryl Eames, the founder of New Hampshire Cannabis Association. So we want to get to them lickety-splickety. But before we do, you're ready to jump into today's news. And actually, I think there's actually two stories, which will be a great lead-in to what we're talking about in New Hampshire. What do you think?
Most definitely. Let's do it.
Let's do it. So last week, the Michigan Department of Treasury announced the distribution of more than $87 million, which is part of the Michigan Regulation and Taxation of Marijuana Act. So this was the taxes collected and they give out to any city, town, municipality, or township, I think they call it in Michigan, that has a location of a dispensary or a cannabis micro business, $59,000 per location. So they gave it out. So cities and counties reaping the benefits. In addition to that, 101 million was distributed to the school aid fund for K-12 education. Another 101 million was distributed to the Michigan Transportation Fund. We wrote about this today in our newsletter. I like when states talk about where the tax money goes. I think it helps normalize legalization, but seems to be a pretty good windfall for cities and towns in Michigan.
Not just a good windfall, but it's an argument for the meta idea that legalized marijuana, whether it's adult use or medical, is here to stay. I mean, the one thing that we don't know about politics is once there's a revenue source, it's hard to put that back into the bottle. And then when you illustrate exactly where the proceeds are going, it makes it that much more human and that much more material.
Yeah. It's also interesting because I think as you saw Michigan and other states legalize, I don't think it was, we need this revenue, therefore we're going to legalize. It was, this is going to be a nice bonus. But I think you've actually seen the script flipped in Pennsylvania a bit, where you had the governor actually say, we need this revenue, we need to legalize because we need the money to go to these things. So it's like, I don't know what the right, but it's almost flipped now that people are actually banking the revenue before they even legalize.
Yeah, it's nice to, it's so complicated, and we're going to talk about the New Hampshire experience coming up. It's so complicated and hard. How many number of tools you have in the toolbox in order to get this across the finish line is key. The sequencing and the order, to your point, it could, become enacted in a way that is completely different on the other end in terms of what people are talking about and what people are prioritizing.
Yeah. Speaking about this is a good segue. Speaking about what people are prioritizing, there's a story out of Canada today, which is a country, and I live here, known for drinking beer. I don't know if you all know Bob and Doug McKenzie, but they are the hosers that made drinking beer in Canada famous. But cannabis seems to be taking a bite out of beer sales. And according to a study in the journal Drug and Alcohol Dependence and reported on actually by Marijuana Moment, cannabis legalization has been associated with a decline in beer sales. And that's not all. Taxes on cannabis have outpaced those on wine and beer, which was actually previously reported at MJ Biz Daily. Brad, I know you are a cannabis lover. You and I have shared that experience for years and years when we probably would have been more accepted to drink more beer. But does this surprise you?
It does not. Everyone's going Calgary sober. Marijuana trumps Molson in Montreal. I think. Sorry, I had to. I got
pretty
my
good. Good, it's okay.
So I think that this is also a precursor of what we're going to see in legalized markets in the United States. The more people have exposure to cannabis as an alternative for relaxation or, whatever you would turn to alcohol, the more we're going to see alcohol sales dissipate. And it's particularly surprising in Canada, given the unique nature of it. But because they've had you leading the charge, I am not surprised.
Yes. I've been buying most of the cannabis, so it's no surprise there. And actually, that is a very good lead-in. I think the juxtaposition of cannabis and alcohol, because we're going to talk about New Hampshire in 1 second. I got to put up some music and bring everybody on stage, but I do think it's a not charge, but a more interesting conversation in New Hampshire, just the way they govern alcohol sales and how they think about cannabis. So, can you be patient for 1 sec? I'll turn on some music and bring everybody back up.
I can't wait.
Awesome. Here we go. Okay. We have with us today State Representative Anita Burroughs. Anita, thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here.
We have Tim Egan. He's a former state representative. He's also an advisor to New Hampshire Cannabis Association. Welcome.
Gentlemen, how you doing?
Good. So you're not driving, right? You're just a passenger.
I am just a passenger.
Perfect.
Georgie's
That
driving.
makes me much. There we go. That makes me feel much more comfortable. And Daryl Eames, the founder of the New Hampshire Cannabis Association. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Daryl, can we start with you? Give us a quick. If people read Cultivated Daily, our newsletter, which everybody subscribed to, they might know some of this. But give us a quick overview of where we are when it comes to cannabis in New Hampshire right now.
Pretty much where we were 20 years ago, aside from medical and decrim. Unfortunately, the New Hampshire House was one of the first legislative bodies to pass a legalization bill. And I had the privilege to actually speak with the person that did that a month or so ago. But, there's this constant battle that's been happening. Our House has been very open to legalization. Our Senate has been historically killing everything that comes their way. But in order to understand what's happening in New Hampshire, we kind of have to roll up for a minute. And just so you know, I also own a consultancy that matches cannabis companies with sources of capital. So I talk to operators all across the country for 7 years. The two biggest problems, of course, are overregulation and underregulation. But, in 2013, the Cole memo came out, and it kind of just stated that as long as you're a licensed entity operating legally within your state, we're not going to come after you. We're going to worry about, people that are breaking some sort of bigger laws. So a lot of very smart people started to try to figure out, how do we thread the needle between a federally illegal activity that we want to make state legal? And the consensus seemed to be that the state should stay a legislative body, and it should create an independent regulatory body, usually a cannabis commission, right? And that cannabis commission would then oversee all the plant touching activities that happen below it. And maybe if it reports somewhere, it's to the side. And the reason was because they didn't want to draw a state line from the plant touching activities to the state, right? Well, we've had a bunch of free market bills, and I think 2 or so years ago, suddenly this concept of, well, maybe the state should just run the retail stores, right? So now you're talking about a concept of the state as the plant touching cannabis entity, which, as you can imagine, opens up a lot of liability for the state, right? The federal government could come in and do some very bad things if they wanted to. So not a very good model. And I think that they realized that, and they kind of went away from it. And so this year, actually last year, at the end of the year, they retained a bill. They put together this commission. The commission's charge was to explore what they call a franchise concept, right? So the concept of the state as a cannabis-related business, a franchisor, that would then oversee the retail stores as franchisees. And, you can kind of get a sense for why they might do that. It appears on the outset that might add one arm's length distance. But when you really dig down into the details, it's actually more risky in some ways than the state being an actual operator, because if you are a franchise, you are putting yourself squarely under the Federal Trade Commission and the federal franchise regulations. So we can talk about that today, but with the help of the sponsors, they created a free market bill, which is HB 1633 this year. And there was this commission that was supposed to come out with a franchise bill. They didn't fulfill that mandate, and everybody was kind of waiting around, figuring they were going to put in this franchise model somewhere. So we wanted a free market alternative to fight for and contrast against that. Well, very early on, we realized something was amiss. That franchise bill never came. And in one of the first hearings for the HB 1633, it was an attempt to hijack the bill and make it the franchise bill. But before we get too deep into that, I just want to talk conceptually. So over here on one side, you have more of the traditional license model with the state as a legislative body. State run, obviously, they are regulating themselves. Franchise, they're regulating the franchises, I guess. But it appears that the real goal was just to have more direct government control and oversight. And so the sponsors of HB 1633 tried to modify that bill and stretch it as far as they could to give the state that power. So we have our state liquor stores, and just a few of those stores are what they call state agency stores. They're basically in markets the government doesn't want to bother investing in, so they allow somebody that might have a convenience store to sell hard alcohol as a state agent. And so we incorporated that model and said, okay, why don't we do this? If our retail stores are state agency type stores, now the concept is the state as the regulatory body, because our liquor commission would be overseeing it and they report directly to the government. Okay. And so that's the kind of framework with which we can now have that conversation of what is going on in New Hampshire.
Yeah, it's interesting because it sounds to me like New Hampshire has unique opportunities and challenges to the way they operate. And it's seeping into cannabis. But I want to go to you, Representative Burroughs, because you're a co-sponsor of the bill. Talk a bit about some of those considerations that Daryl was talking about, how it factors into the legislation that you are pushing, and sort of where that stands now, and sort of how you're thinking about it.
Sure. Well, I've been in the legislature since 2018, and I'd like to say that this effort, cannabis legislation effort, is Groundhog Day. Every day, every year. So we go through this again and again and again. And I also say that if you ask, we have I think the largest legislative body in the country. If you ask 400 legislators what should be in this bill, you're going to get 400 different answers. And some of them wildly diverging. I personally would have a matzo ball soup truck that sells cannabis, but that's not going to happen. So
there's a person in New York that wants to make, I think it's called Bubby's 420 matzo ball soup. She's in Buffalo. It's a thing.
Qualities no matter what.
That's awesome. I have to check that out. But so this was a compromise, all the way around. It's been a strong bipartisan effort. The prime sponsor, Erica Leon. I mean, it's just really done. I have to give a shout out to her. She's done an amazing job. I've never seen anyone work as hard as she has to get this through. So we've all really worked well together. I really appreciated the opportunity to work with Erica. And as Daryl said, the House is usually very supportive of this, and the Senate kills it. And I think the Senate is pushing for more state regulation, more involvement of the Liquor Commission, and I think many people who are involved in this bill, if we had our druthers, the Liquor Commission wouldn't be involved at all. But it was a crapshoot. We get it legalized now, or we wait to see who's going to be in the governor's office. Our governor is stepping down, Governor Sununu. We don't know who's going to be there. So it's kind of like swallow. I don't mean to say that this bill is bad, but, let's get it going and we can tweak it. So it's do it now or wait 2 to 8 years maybe till we see this opportunity again.
Yeah. Tim, I want to go to you. You're a longtime advocate, obviously, on this issue. When the Cannabis Association announced you'd be sort of joining and helping their efforts, they called you a pro-cannabis reform warrior. Talk a bit about the journey, but also talk about sort of your view of where things stand now, but also broaden it out because the context changed. As Representative Burroughs was saying, 2018 to now, every other New England state has legalized and sort of come online. How does that factor into some of the conversation happening in New Hampshire?
Well, it's really a sort of a horrible roller coaster story. I was pleased. I had an opportunity to work with the Cannabis Certification Council out of Denver and learned a lot about the sustainability side of the industry. And when I was asked to build an event for them, I reached out to Representative Rennie Cushing, who Anita and I know well. He was sort of the leading advocate in New Hampshire for legalization. He asked me then to chair the cannabis caucus. I rounded up about 40, 50 Democrats, actually reached across the aisle because I'm sort of a blue dog Democrat, businessman, in the media business. And so I began to try and find both sides. So right near the end of my second term, I didn't get reelected. I said, as I was leaving the House, we've been trying to pass legalization here for 4 years. And then in that same amount of time, Massachusetts legalized and is now making a $4 billion industry. So, there's that roller coaster, up, down, up, down. Then here we go again. We had a lot of support. And here, sorry, I'm going into the tunnel. Let's see if I can put a light on.
It's okay.
Maybe not a light. Minority Leader Matt Wilhelm, Majority Leader Jason Osborne decided to support this bill. A bill last year. We passed that bill in the House with almost an 80% approval rating. Again, got all the way to the Senate. Thought we had some votes that would get it passed, and 4 or 5 former members of the caucus who were Republican representatives who ran and won for Senate then decided at literally, when I said last minute, 48 hours out, I think we're going to vote the other way. So a 14-10 in favor vote went 14-10 against. And the very next morning, the governor said, here are my 8 principles that I'm going to want to see to legalize cannabis in New Hampshire. First time that he had spoken about it in 4 or 5 years. So while it was a failure to pass a bill, it was a success to get the governor out of the woods. So now, and again, I equally want to give a shout out to Eric Leon, who's not feeling well and can't join us today. Her and Anita have been tremendous in picking up that ball and going, great, now we know what the legislature wants on the House side. We now know what the governor wants. And now we're sort of in this, I'll say, a little bit of a wrestling match with some of these senators going, let's figure out what gets us there. I think the big picture that we realized is, and I got to hold my phone so I can't make my little diagram, which is the island of prohibition, right? New Hampshire is in the middle of Vermont, Maine, and Massachusetts, where we're seeing people drive over the border, and we're losing anywhere between $20 and $40 million a year. So you take that with people want the cannabis, they want to use it recreationally, they want to use it medicinally, and we have this opportunity to create an industry here that would generate more revenue. And maybe Anita will talk a little bit about, an important part that was to her and I was where the revenue goes. But it's really been a struggle. But I think it's something that when Daryl said, hey, you didn't get reelected, would you want to chair this board, build out a board to be more aggressive? I said, why not? Because it's not a struggle I want to see stop. I have the pleasure, and this is sort of the last thing I'll say, I have the pleasure of teaching over in Vermont for Vermont State University. We actually have a 12-credit cannabis studies program. I teach cannabis business. I see the local economic development impact that happens no matter what field you're in. Processing, testing, cultivation, retailing, alternative products like, tinctures and drinks and edibles. And it is an economic development boom for any state. And it's something that, because it's not federally legal, it's very state developed, right? You don't have to worry about competition coming across the border. So any state that does it well, does it really well. And so, we're trying to sort of figure out, let's take all the best practices, that we've seen around us and use them to create a bill that we feel has some viability. And again, I'll say it's something that, we feel we're matching up to what the governor wants. And we sort of have to put the pressure on him to tell his own Republican senators, hey, the House and the Democrats and the industry are all on the same page together here, people. Where are you guys?
So one of the benefits of being last in your region is that you could learn from the experiences of your surrounding states. Anyone really, what do you look to piggyback in terms of what's succeeded in other markets, and how have you been informed so you know what explicitly to avoid? Maybe starting with Representative Burroughs.
Well, I can tell you right now that I think it was Tim talked about the revenue stream that we're losing, and we're seeing a conga line of cars going over the border every day to get product. So, I think the main thing that we're seeing in the other states is that we're losing out on this money, that we need 65% of, in this bill, 65% of the money that we raise is going to go towards education. Which we really need to fill those coffers. So, it's just, it makes no sense. It makes no sense to see that money go out the door and down the street. I've heard stories that people can't even get into parking lots on the weekend, and all these outlets have New Hampshire plates. So it's really a lost opportunity, and it's inevitable. So let's go for it. Let's do it. Let's get it done.
Yeah, Jay,
like
if I could follow up on that. You talk.
Go ahead.
You talked about in your open in referencing Michigan. When I first got involved in this, like I said, through some sustainability work in Colorado, they had earmarked a percentage, and Colorado in the first couple of years was seeing about $100 million of revenue going towards their education department. So that was an important part of this bill, especially in a state where there's, like New Hampshire, there's no income tax, there's no sales tax, there's only property tax, and our SWEP, our education property tax, is what really drives people's property taxes. So part of our play in this bill has been, well, if you like cannabis, right, just call your legislator and tell them you want it. But if you don't, this bill actually will help lower your property taxes, because we know that education is our leading cost in the state. And we actually have had troubles and Supreme Court rulings in the state Supreme Court about our failure to accurately evaluate towns' costs. So this is less of a social issue, and now it's an economic issue for the state. And so I think that's finally why the governor is sort of coming around. And it takes people like Anita Burroughs, who have been clamoring at the Commerce Committee and convincing Republican legislators to pass this bill out of her committee that she's the minority leader of, 17-3. That's a great, when you talk about 21 people who make a decision on a piece of legislation, getting 17 people they get the big picture here, and it's commerce. They get the understanding that it's an economic impact that can value no matter who you are and who wants to use it.
And I think I can help there too. The biggest problems with states that have legalized literally is overregulation and taxation, or underregulation. California is so overly regulated and taxed that we're hearing a lot of their cultivators aren't even renewing licenses right now. Then you look at Oklahoma's rollout. All right, it's way too underregulated, and you had cartels essentially going in and setting up illegal grow operations, right? So it's about the right amount of regulation and taxation, and that's why we feel that a free market with a bit of that proper amount of regulation is important, and why a franchise is just simply too risky. Marijuana Moment put out an article, and in it they said, despite state legality, technically the federal government could shut down a franchise's operation or the franchisors, which would have the same effect. In another article, they say federal and state franchise agencies have broad powers to punish franchise law violators and may freeze assets, order restitution, issue cease and desist orders, ban violators from selling franchises, and recover substantial penalties. What we have to understand here is HB 1633 addresses the governor's concerns in a way that doesn't stretch into that operational control that would make it a franchise. Because all it would take is one franchisee to lodge a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission, and if they found it had merit, you could have an investigation by the federal government into the state of New Hampshire, their devices, their communications, their accounts, their own property. This would be absolute insanity. And in one version of the bill we saw, the state law apparatus would actually be able to help the federal government investigate the state. And so we're trying to say, don't overcorrect because of the over or under regulation in other states. There is a way to get this done. This bill does that. It addresses the governor's needs. It deserves to be seen by the governor so he can make a decision, but don't overcorrect into something that's going to make it even more risky than if the state of New Hampshire was a cannabis operator themselves, which is insane enough.
Daryl, can I just interject that the irony is that it's the Senate is pushing for the franchise model, and that may be the thing that it's undoing. And I won't mention his name. One of the senators is leading the charge against this. And I asked him when he testified in Commerce, can you explain your issue with the franchise model? And he couldn't do it. So I don't really know why that came about, but that's what's going to undo it if it doesn't pass.
Can I ask one last question before we sort of wrap this up, and hopefully get you to promise you'll come back as this unfolds? But I want to ask Representative Burroughs, because you are an elected leader, you are not immune to the politics of this. Like, what has been the response, I guess, from your constituents and probably your colleagues too, knowing that it's been a bipartisan effort? But how when your constituents know that this is something you're leading on, what has been their reaction generally?
In my area, which is, I'd say it's somewhat a conservative district, the response is overwhelmingly want this to pass. We get a ton of communications on bills of importance. This one, I mean, probably 20-1, 20 in favor. Maybe I'll get one opposed. So, and the polls have all shown that 74% of people in New Hampshire want this to pass. So it's the Senate that is the one that's keeping us from moving forward right now.
Yeah. I want to thank you all for being here today, and we look forward to connecting with you as things unfold. So Representative Burroughs, Daryl Eames, Tim Egan, thank you so much for making time in your various locales today. And we really enjoyed the conversation, hearing what's happening in New Hampshire, the paths forward, some of the interesting considerations happening in the state, which is, as I mentioned before we came on, not a home away from home, but a place that I find I spend a lot of time, and certainly the family does too. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks
we will keep you updated.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Jay and Brad, thanks for having us. When you come to New Hampshire, Jay, let us know.
I'll give you the dates. I'll send you the dates right now.
I hear there's some great pancakes.
That's right.
And we can enjoy some after enjoying some cannabis.
I love it. That's going to be it for today on Cultivated Live. We encourage you to subscribe to our daily newsletter at cultivated.news. Follow us on LinkedIn or smash the subscribe button. That's what the kids make me say on YouTube. Brad, as always, thank you for being my co-host on United States of Cannabis. Thank you, True New Hampshire, we're going to call you. We'll be back here tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern on LinkedIn and YouTube. Have a great Tuesday, everybody.
Peace out.
Bye.
Bye.